Security advisor authorized a team to create contingency plans in case Vladimir Putin made an extreme move. We want to get a closer look at this with Christine Parthemore. She's CEO of the Council on Strategic Risks and also a professor in the Global Security Studies program at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you so much, Professor, for being with us. First and foremost, how concerned should we be about Russia actually utilizing a chemical or a biological weapon?
Thanks for having me. I'm extremely concerned about his use of chemical or biological weapons. Unfortunately, he illegally possesses these weapons, we believe, and they've crossed that line before. So they've used chemical weapons with the poisoning of Navalny and the Skripal attack in the United Kingdom. And Russia really held Syria's dictator Bashar al-Assad's hand as he was slaughtering his own people with chemical weapons. So we're very concerned that they don't fear crossing that line the way that they should, and that they don't fear the illegality of that. And also that the conflict is just not going the way the Russians had calculated clearly, which puts them in a position to potentially be interested in utilizing something that they believe could change the game in their favor.
Are you confident in the gauge the U.S. and NATO allies have in the capabilities for warfare of that type from Russia? And is there any point where you mentioned that President Putin, it's not going the way that he wanted to. You would see this as potentially a form of desperation on his part?
Yes, exactly. I think it would be a use of desperation to try to flip the dynamics on the battlefield in specific locations in their favor. So I'm very worried about it in terms of U.S. and NATO knowledge of what they're doing. From my experience when I worked in the Pentagon, I think our understanding of Russian capabilities is very good. And it's also aligned with the fact that they've used advanced chemical agents like Novichok. They've shown their hand in terms of what they're capable of doing.
So I have to note the close relationship between Russia and Syria when we look at what's happened over the last, say, 6 years. How does the Syrian government's multiple uses, we should point out, of chemical weapons potentially factor into Russian calculations with Ukraine?
I believe that Russians calculating, because of the experience with Syria, that he would be able to use chemical weapons or biological weapons in a perhaps targeted way. For example, on specific neighborhoods or population centers, the way Assad did in Syria, and potentially get away with it in terms of not having a direct military response from the United States or NATO. My understanding is that our national security advisor has issued a strong warning against Russia, calling into question that belief that we would not do anything significant in response. Keeping our options open in terms of what we would do in response is the smart thing to do right now. And that appears to be the posture that we're taking.
Do you feel that the U.S. is drawing an overt red line? And if they haven't done it thus far, how do they make that happen realistically?
I don't think that we have drawn a very clear overt red line. And when President Obama did that with Syria, I was sitting a few yards in front of him when he made the red line announcement in Syria. As is publicly known now, that was done in such a public manner because we were very concerned about an imminent, very significant attack. And so it was really meant to save the lives of potentially thousands of Syrians at that particular time. I don't think we've drawn a stark red line in the same way right now, but doing things like sharing the intelligence and overtly naming the concern that we believe that Putin may be gearing up to use chemical or biological weapons, as well as providing private warnings that he's not going to get away with it, is the better approach in this particular circumstance.
I know U.S. Tiger teams, it's been reported, are meeting regularly to decide how to respond if something like that happens, and that the severity of the attack would dictate a response. What do you have any gauge of how severe some sort of chemical or biological attack would have to be for the U.S. to do something in an actionable manner to respond?
I believe that the way we're treating it and the way we should treat it is that crossing the line to any use of weapons of mass destruction is prohibited under international law and absolutely cruel and horrific, and that we would treat the situation as such. So the severity would certainly dictate the nature of our response at any particular moment. But NATO's posture in this conflict has been pretty clear, and I'm sure that they're working on what would trigger different changes in that potential posture as part of their contingency planning. I should say as well, though, that type of contingency planning happens all the time. There are professionals that walk through this, including the military options as well as the diplomatic approach under such circumstances. So no matter what happens, if they do cross into the use of weapons of mass destruction, any kind, I'm sure at least part of our strategy will be a very significant diplomatic surge to try to make sure that in terms of international institutions and in the eyes of the rest of the world, that Russia is fully seen as the pariah state that it's become.
Christine Parthemore, your expertise is so valuable. Thank you for taking time to be with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.
Before the war, Ukraine exported its wheat supplies to the entire world, but now there's real concern that an already